Here's the question that most of us have forgotten to ask ourselves. How many of us, let's be very honest, how many of us were saved in the mixture church? Now, some aren't even going to understand that question. They go, what's the mixture church mean? But for a Grace House, you pretty much know what I'm talking about. You were saved in the middle of your sins, sitting in a church that right now in the Grace community we would say is preaching mixture, and they're going to end up putting people in bondage. And yet we got saved. We found Christ in the middle of it. Why? Because wherever He is, Jesus looks good. Wherever He is, Jesus is a winner. I mean, in the middle of the most mixed up sermon and theology and doctrine you can find, if the spotlight is put on a lovely Jesus, He wins every time. He rises above bad theology. He rises above poor songwriting. He rises above lousy Sunday school teaching. He rises above cockiness and pride and arrogance and foolishness. And somehow, some way, we all, in the middle of a bunch of flawed churches and flawed sermons by flawed people with flawed singing, we found Jesus and Jesus found us. How in the world did that happen? Because Jesus started out in your life lovely. Amen. The first time you had a revelation of Him, it was the most beautiful thing you'd ever heard in your life. It was beyond words. When you heard about this man who walked on the water and healed the sick and raised the dead, this man who wrapped himself up in an earth suit and went to the cross and died on your behalf, and then 3 days later a stone rolled away and he came out of the tomb, you didn't worry about whether the theology of eschatology was right or wrong. You didn't worry about whether they were getting it right in regards to tongues. You didn't worry about whether they had it all figured out in regards to Trinitarian or oneness. You didn't know whether you should dunk, sprinkle, say a word, not say a word, how you should baptize, didn't know, didn't care, because in that moment you heard about a man named Jesus. And man, it was beautiful. And I don't know, you may have walked an aisle, you raised a hand, you went in a room, you shook someone's hand, you signed a card, I don't know, but somewhere along the way you began to believe. And He beat everything you'd ever heard in your life. He was better than everything else you'd ever encountered. And it's why you're here tonight, because somewhere along the way, Jesus won in your life. That's when Jesus was lovely. He was beautiful. He was awesome. He was bigger than all of your problems. He was bigger than all of your sicknesses. He was bigger than all of your ignorances. He was bigger than all of your failures and your sins, and you knew it. And if you ever had any trouble or any problems or any failures, you were one moment away from hearing His name again and seeing the vision in your spirit about who He was. He's beautiful. Right in the midst of false doctrine, some of us met Jesus. We all met Jesus. And then life happened. And religion became a part of our lives. Because closely attached to this Jesus is His church. If you're going to know Him, you must know His church. And if you're going to know His church, you're going to have to be a part of His church, which manifests itself in a local building with leadership and rules and regulations and a staff and a doctrine and a dogma. And you jumped in not because you thought it was cool or because it was local or because you wanted to belong. You jumped in because Jesus was lovely, and that's where you found Him. And so you went back to the place where you found Him and you did what they told you to do. And in some cases it was sign a card, give some money, join, do this, do that, go to work. And you did it happily. Why? Because Jesus was lovely and wonderful, and that's where you found Him. And so why wouldn't you work? Why wouldn't you work in the place where He was so great? Until you began to work and work and work and work. And that same Jesus that had started out lovely and wonderful and beautiful suddenly began to be obscured. Oh, He was still great. When you caught glimpses of Him, He was still wonderful. He was still majestic. He was still beautiful, but it was as if He were hiding now, harder to find behind the next committee and the next play and the next song and the next service and the next thing. It was as if he was dodging you in the shadows. It is not what he used to be. Somewhere, somehow, the luster fell a little bit off of this Jesus.